Sorry, it's
So
off.
as we think
There we go.
about this idea of, again, of being culturally responsive and understanding our students based on what we've been talking about for the last couple of days, when we see students who are struggling in our class, we will quickly think about, well, why? What's going on for their failure or whether or not they're struggling? And so do we quickly look at the student characteristics, right? Oh, well, they're from the single family home, or they're already they're just at a level C when they should be at a level O, or, so we're looking at all of these characteristics from our students. And is that the first place that we should be looking, especially if we're making some assumptions? We hear all the time, I get it from teachers all the time, the home life. Oh, they live in that zip code. There's a single family, there's single parent home in the house, or, they live on that side of town, or they go to that school. But do we ever think about the possibility that that responsiveness, again, that connectedness, that relatedness to our students, and are we doing some of that critical reflection for ourselves? Right? We're really quick to jump into the conditions of the students, but we don't look at some of the symptoms. What might be some of the things that we're doing in our classrooms that are causing the triggers for them to behave or to react the way they're reacting? All right.
Oops, didn't see that one. Okay.
So when we think about our own beliefs, right, when you think about those questions that you wrote down and reflect on, there are some factors that are influencing our students' academic achievement. So there are things that we think, right, and it turns into some form of an action, which then reacts to our students and their academic achievement. So there are things that we're doing. And so we have this scale, I guess we would call it, that goes from having this deficit perspective all the way to an affirming perspective. And that's, a big premise of this 2-week session is to make sure that we are critically examining ourselves, right? That intercultural competence, really understanding ourselves well enough to A, see where we are in terms of what is our perspective, but then B, let's see if we can make some progress towards seeing our students from a more affirming perspective. And so when we move from a deficit perspective to an affirming perspective, we are acknowledging those cultural differences and some of the structured inequities and inequalities that are in place, some of the things that we just may not have any absolute control over. So when we think about deficit perspectives, I wanted to give just a quick historical perspective. We were looking at this more so from a research orientation. And so traditionally, kids of color, people of color aren't represented in the research, which typically will translate into this is the normative group, and anything outside of the normative group is now abnormal. And so when we're looking at some of the tests, some of the, I've got a couple of counseling friends and school psychologist friends, when they're looking at some of the assessments they do on kids, you can tell very quickly that here is the normative group. And the further away you are from that normative group, the more abnormal you become, which means that we're again looking at it from this deficit orientation instead of this strengths perspective. And so what we typically hear, and some of this is old school, from the 40s and 50s all the way up until now, but it is that normative group, which typically is the white children who could be in those groups. And then the abnormal we typically will see, and of course, again, we're looking at the research and the data, children of color. So some of the phrases that you may have heard in one form or another talking about kids, abnormal, incompetent, the culturally deprived, which always is interesting to me because don't we all have some culture? So if my culture is not like your culture, that means that I'm deprived? Interesting, right? At risk is a big red flag, and the only issue I have with at risk is if they would add what kids are at risk of, that would give me a qualifier in terms of a specific behavior instead of a background or a culture of a kid. So if they would say at risk of not passing, graduating from high school, all right, so I can see maybe some of the academic factors that we're talking about. But when you just blanket at risk, what's that typically a code for? Kids of color, right? Pathological is an old school one. Deviant is on its way back. We're starting to see that more now, which is, again, scary. Deficit, dysfunctional, and disadvantaged. And I just read something in the newspaper about that idea of disadvantaged, and kind of goes back to that culturally deprived.
What other words have you heard or are used to describe students that might be outside of what's considered normal? Anything that's not represented there? Okay.
So when we're thinking about deficit thinking, it exists when educators hold negative, stereotypical, counterproductive views, right? So if we're trying to get our kids to elevate in their reading skills or whatever it is, but we're using counterproductive language, especially when we're using it in front of the kids, we're sending them that message, right? We're sending them that message. It also means that we begin to see our students as victims of their environment, right? Victims of poverty or their ethnicity or the neighborhood they live in, or, oh, there's just no parents involved. And what I have to tell my students is that you have no control over these things anyway. Unless you're going to bring the entire family into your home and re-raise grown people and children, how much control do we have over these things versus what I do have control over from 8 to 5, right? Or 7:45 to 4:45 or whatever it is. And so we see this inclination for people to want to fix kids. Oh, I wish I could just take them all home with me. As if what's at home isn't enough, right? And so we have to be careful because when we're saying, I wish we could bring them home, we're saying because we want them to fit our ideals of who they should be or what should be going on at home versus the reality, right, of their classroom or what's going on in their, or not the classroom, but what is going on at home. And so we've spent some time looking at different grants and things that have come out for kids of color in different environments. And we wonder why you put this out. Why in the world would this work if you're still coming from this deficit orientation? Something is wrong with them. Here's some money for you to come up with an idea to fix them instead of, again, coming back for that strengths-based perspective. So we also want to acknowledge that being different culturally does not equal deficiency. And I think that's one of the key points. Difference does not equal deficient, right? We're different, but we still all have our own strengths. And so behaviors, language learning, a lot of what you've heard earlier today, and especially with Dr. Hancock and Dr. Lewis yesterday, it's just different. Doesn't mean that they're deficient in any way. The family life community, the code switching, the language, right? All the different beliefs and values. And so we have to make sure that we understand this difference between our students are just acting in a way that is representative of their culture versus something is really going on, right? Something is really wrong.
And I think that's such a huge point. I just want to pause for a minute and let that sink in. So we're talking and we're concentrating all this week on these inequities and levels of oppression that may exist within school. But that's not just it for these kids. It's their whole life. All of these and again, not speaking just to the issues of race, but all forms of what might be considered a disability. They don't just have this in school. So then you go home and it may be to a housing project, or maybe you need health care and you're denied that health care because you don't have the financial means to support that. And we know that this overrepresentation of Black boys in special education then just becomes that cycle of this overrepresentation of African American, what is it, the pipeline, or
prison, the school to prison pipeline.
School to prison pipeline, thank you. So we see that outside of just the school setting. And for me, this was a real huge, when I was in the doc program and seeing that, gosh, I was a classroom teacher and I was just focused on what happens in my school, but having to step back and see this huge, the big picture of how this impacts every single aspect of a child's life, everything else, it was overwhelming for me.
And so from a deficit orientation, right? Always looking for the bad or seeing the bad versus understanding that there are just differences in culture. And then considering that there are some things that cause outcomes that are beyond our situation or our control. We move towards being more affirming. And so as Crystal goes to the next slide, I will never forget this story. My second year teaching, a parent came to me and told me, I'm kind of stuck in this quandary. I don't know what to do. I have a job, but it does not pay well. So I can't get my child all the extra resources that you're asking for. And I deliberately picked that job because I need the health care, right? I need to stay on Medicaid because my child has asthma. Now I have an opportunity for a better job, but that means I'm out of the bracket for making money to the point where now I can't get Medicaid. So which one do I do? And I'm looking at her like, I'm 21 years old. I don't have any kids, and so we looked online and just looked at different services, or is there a way to supplement, or, just trying to help her understand. But that is definitely something that was institutionalized, or it was a structured inequity that I had no control over, but it was directly affecting my kid and his mom. Right? So what we have to remember and consider that these things are going on in our classrooms, and they are coming to us, and there are things that we have to work through one way or another, or our students can again fall through the cracks. And so I think we're going to stop here with understanding that we have to, and this is a process, this isn't a silver bullet. You're not going to end the 2-week institute and just automatically be more culturally responsive and affirming. But we want you to make sure that you're making progress towards, right? So instead of seeing our students as victims, what about seeing them at promise? What are their strengths, right? What are their capabilities? So think about the words that you use to describe students. I ask my teacher friends all the time, so how was your day? Who's the student who gave you the most grief? All right, so how would you describe them in the positive way? And they're stuck because they always want to think about, well, they did this and they have that and their mom's like this and know this and they live on this side of town and blah, blah, blah. What are the strengths? Like, what are they good at, right? We have to kind of flip that on its head. Have we ever thought to stop and reflect? On some of it could be us. It's a mismatch between home and school. Kids don't see the relevance or the usefulness of what we're teaching. And so why would they be engaged? This stuff is stupid, right? I had a student tell me that, living in Florida, teaching in Florida, and there was content on our Common Core, or not Common Core, but our state standard on snowplows. What the world? I live in Daytona Beach, Florida, where it's always 70 degrees, 80 degrees. Why would my kids know about snowplows? This is stupid, right? And so I quickly had to adjust and figure out a way to get them connected to it. Otherwise, they were going to tap out even more than they were, right? By them even verbalizing, this is dumb. And so we want to make sure that we are finding out what our students are bringing to school, their strengths, right? Going back to Dr. Parikh Fox's talk about what are the skills that our students have, right? Those assets that they bring to school. Those are those funds of knowledge. Kids know stuff. They are not blank slates, right? So how can we connect to what they already know, right? And so we have to make sure that we're using our students' backgrounds to see the differences in their development. They're not all going to look the same. We want them to end up at the same place by the end of the year, but that road that they take might look differently. And it's not a deficiency if that road is different, right? So we've always got to make sure that we're just making progress towards, again, shifting our mindset, not mapping our stuff onto our kids, and really seeing them from an affirming perspective, because that benefits not only us, it benefits them, because that's the message that we're sending them.